These three true small-town horror stories are inspired by real events. They come from the quiet corners of the world, places you might drive through without a second thought, and they involve the very people who document and protect their communities: a police officer, a store owner, and a historian. First, an entire community is terrorized by a silent, shadowy figure that appears at the exact same time every night. Then, a small general store becomes the site of a violent and unexplainable haunting, all captured on security footage. And finally, a historian discovers that over 800 people vanished from an isolated town, leaving behind only a journal describing a beautiful, irresistible call. It's a reminder that no matter how close you are to your neighbors, you never truly know what's listening in the silence between houses. For more stories that dig into the darkness on the edge of town, subscribe and turn on all notifications. In 1987, Northeast Ohio was a place stitched together by quiet, rural towns. At night, the silence out in the county was a physical thing, a heavy blanket over the cornfields and farmhouses. You learned to tell who was coming down the road not by sight, but by the specific rattle and engine noise of their truck. For Officer Jensen, this was home. He was a cop who had been on the job long enough to see just about everything people could do to one another. His world was built on things he could touch and prove. The solid weight of his service weapon on his hip, the worn leather of his patrol car's steering wheel, and the familiar sharp crackle of the police radio. He was a man of evidence, of cause and effect. He had no room in his life for ghost stories. The calls started in late October, when the nights got colder and longer. The first one came in from an old man, Mr. Nathy, who lived on a long, dark stretch of road out past the county line. He called dispatch at exactly 3:17 in the morning. He claimed a prowler was in his yard, just standing there by an old oak tree. Jensen took the call. By the time his headlights washed over the property, there was nothing. Not a snapped twig, not a footprint in the damp grass. Jensen logged it as a routine call, probably just an old man whose eyes were playing tricks on him in the dark. He figured that was the end of it. The next night, another call came in. The clock on the dispatch console read 3:17 a.m. It was a woman this time, from a neighborhood on the opposite side of town. She was so scared she wouldn't give her name, her voice a strained whisper over the phone line. She said there was a man outside her house, standing across the street just watching. Tall and silent, she said. It was an odd coincidence, but Jensen knew that fear could be contagious in a small town. Maybe someone had heard about Mr. Nathy's call and gotten spooked. He drove through the woman's neighborhood, his spotlight cutting beams through the darkness, checking between houses and behind bushes. He found nothing. But the calls didn't stop. For 3 straight nights, the pattern was the same. A call would come in at precisely 3:17 a.m. from a different location each time, and the description was always the same: a tall, dark figure. No face, no clothes they could make out, just a shadow shaped like a man that stood perfectly still and watched. The town was getting on edge. You could hear it in the voices of people at the gas station, see it in the way more porch lights were being left on all night. At the station, Jensen's colleagues started talking. Their usual jokes were replaced with nervous questions. Jensen stayed out of it. He was a cop, and cops need proof. His frustration grew with each passing night. He would get to the location within minutes of the call, his tires crunching on gravel as he pulled up. He'd walk the properties himself, the beam of his heavy flashlight cutting a clean circle in the night. He listened for the sound of someone running through the leaves, for the snap of a branch. He found nothing. The dew on the grass was always undisturbed. There were never any footprints, It was impossible. A person had to leave a mark. This thing, whatever it was, left nothing behind. Logic, the foundation of Jensen's entire career, was failing him, and a cold, hard anger was starting to build in his chest. On the fourth night, Jensen decided he'd had enough. At 3 a.m., he killed his engine and parked his patrol car down the street from the Nathy house, where it had all started. He sat in the profound quiet, the windows down, letting the cold night air fill the car. The only sound was the faint, rhythmic tick-tick-tick of the car's clock on the dashboard. He was waiting. He was daring it to show up. He watched the digital numbers change, 3:15, 3:16. At exactly 3:17 a.m., it was there. It stood in Mr. Nathy's front yard, maybe 50 yards away. It was just as the callers had described, but worse. It was unnaturally tall, a solid column of blackness that seemed to swallow the dim light from the street lamp down the road. It had no features, no face, no form other than a basic human outline. It was utterly still, like a statue carved from shadow. A feeling washed over Jensen that he had never felt before. It was a deep, paralyzing cold that had nothing to do with the night air. His training, his experience, his entire sense of the world, it all evaporated in an instant. He reached for the radio mic clipped to his shoulder, but his fingers felt clumsy and thick. The words wouldn't form in his throat. He was a police officer, and he couldn't call for backup. What would he even say? The thing just stood there, paying no attention to his car. It wasn't human. He knew it with a certainty that terrified him. The click of his seatbelt unbuckling sounded like a firecracker in the dead silence. He drew his weapon, and the cold, checkered grip of the pistol felt small and useless in his hand. He pushed the heavy car door open, and it made a low groaning sound. He stepped out onto the road, the crunch of his boots on the loose asphalt sounding impossibly loud. He took one step towards the yard, his heart hammering against his ribs. He took another. And then it was gone. It didn't run. It didn't fade away. One moment, the perfect black silhouette was standing there, a hole in the fabric of the night. The next, there was only an empty, dew-covered lawn. For the next 2 nights, the whole department was on edge. Jensen had told his sergeant what he saw, his voice flat and measured, sticking only to the facts. The sergeant, a man Jensen had known for 20 years, just listened and nodded, his face pale under the fluorescent office lights. The calls continued, 3:17 a.m., but now the figure was closer. It was seen in driveways, then on front walkways. It was as if it were testing how close it could get. The final call came from a house on the very edge of town, bordering a thick, dark forest. It was a man, his voice a choked whisper that the dispatcher could barely hear. He said the figure was on his front porch. It was standing right at his door, its form blocking the small porch light. Then the man on the phone let out a short, sharp gasp. After a moment of dead air, he whispered that it was gone. And then, it was over. The calls stopped. The figure was never seen again. The nervous quiet in the town slowly faded back to its normal, peaceful silence. The case was never solved. It was filed away as unsubstantiated. But Jensen had to write his own report. He typed it himself, detailing everything he saw that night in Mr. Nathy's yard. He wrote down the impossible facts, the specific time, the unnatural height, the complete lack of evidence, and its instantaneous disappearance. He was a man of facts, and the facts were simple. Something had been there. That official police report, typed on a manual typewriter in 1987, still exists somewhere in a dusty file cabinet. It's a cold, hard piece of paper that proves a town's shared nightmare was, for a few short nights, terrifyingly real. In 2019, in a quiet piece of south-central Pennsylvania, there was a small general store that served as the heart of its town. It was the kind of place that smelled of old wood, floor dust, and the coffee that was always brewing. The owner was a woman named Olivia. She was a no-nonsense person, someone who believed in hard work and common sense. Ghost stories and strange tales weren't her thing. If something didn't have a simple explanation, it was usually because of a simple mistake. And that's how it started, with what seemed like simple mistakes. One Tuesday morning, Olivia was sweeping the main aisle before the first customers arrived. The quiet scraping of the broom against the floorboards was the only sound. That's when she saw it. A single box of cereal, brand new, was lying flat on the floor. It was right in front of the shelf where it belonged, but it was the only thing out of place in the entire store. It was as if it had just decided to fall. But she had stocked that very shelf the night before. She knew for a fact everything had been straight and tidy. With a sigh, she picked it up, slid it back into its spot, and went on with her work. She figured the old building was just settling. A few days later, it was a jar of pickles. It was in the same aisle, sitting perfectly upright on the floor, about a foot from the shelf. She just stood there for a moment, staring at it. There was no good reason for it to be there. She shook her head, a little more annoyed this time, and put it back. She told herself she was just tired, working too many hours. That's all it was. The feeling that something was wrong began to creep in when the old bells tied to the front door would jingle. The sound was clear and cheerful, just as it always was when a customer came in. But when she'd look up from the register, nobody was there. The door was shut tight. It happened once, and she brushed it off. It happened again an hour later. The third time, the cheerful sound of the bells felt mocking. A heavy sense of wrongness settled over her. She started to worry about a shoplifter, someone clever enough to get in and out without being seen. The thought made her angry. This store was her life, and she wouldn't let anyone mess with it. That evening, she installed new security cameras. She put a high-definition one right over the main aisle, pointing directly at the spot where things kept showing up on the floor. The next morning, she checked the recordings. She fast-forwarded through hours of empty footage until she saw it. A jar of strawberry jam slid smoothly off the middle of a shelf, as if pushed by an invisible hand. It hung in the air for a fraction of a second before it dropped. The recording had no sound, but she could imagine the loud crash as it hit the floor, splattering sticky red jam and shards of glass everywhere. She played it back, again and again. On the video, the aisle was empty. There was no person, no hand, no string, nothing. Just a shelf, and then a jar of jam falling through empty space. The proof was right there on the screen, clear as day, but her mind couldn't accept it. Common sense fought a losing battle with what her eyes were seeing. She went out and cleaned up the mess, the sweet smell of strawberries making her feel sick. The sticky residue wouldn't come off the old wood easily, and she knew the feeling in her mind wouldn't go away either. These were not simple mistakes. Something was happening in her store. The quiet worry that had taken root in Olivia's life soon grew into a real, solid fear. The incidents started happening more often, and they got more violent. It wasn't just cereal boxes and pickle jars anymore. One afternoon, with a few customers browsing, a gallon can of white paint launched itself from a high shelf. It flew clear across the aisle and slammed into the opposite wall. The sound of the impact was a deafening thud that made everyone freeze. It left a huge white splatter on the old wallpaper, like a wound. The customers just stared, their faces pale. They left their items on the counter and walked out without a word. The store, her store, no longer felt like her own. When she was alone, she started to hear noises. Faint scratching sounds would come from inside the walls, like a trapped animal trying to claw its way out. The floorboards would creak behind her, the sound of a heavy footstep when no one was there. The feeling of being watched was constant. It was heavy and suffocating, like the air itself was pressing in on her. One night, long after closing, she was reviewing the day's security footage in her small back office. The camera in the back aisle showed a long shelf of canned goods. As she watched, the cans began to shake. First one, then another, then the whole row. They rattled against each other, a faint, tinny scraping sound coming through the computer's speakers. Then, all at once, an entire row of canned corn and peas was swiped off the shelf. They crashed to the floor in a loud, clattering heap. A strange whistling noise followed the crash, like wind whipping through a tunnel, but the footage showed no open windows or doors. It was just a clean, violent sweep by an unseen force. That was it. The proof was absolute. This was not a prank. This was not the building settling. This was something else, something real and hostile. The terror of not knowing what it was or what it wanted was too much to carry by herself. She decided to call the local news station. Maybe, she thought, if someone else saw it, she wouldn't feel like she was losing her mind. A reporter came the next day. He was skeptical, his smile a little too polite. Olivia said nothing. She just led him to the office and played the video of the cans. The reporter's smile faded. He watched it once, then asked her to play it again. He left with a copy of the footage, completely silent. That night, the story was on the evening news. Soon, the footage was all over the internet. Olivia's little corner of Pennsylvania was the center of attention. People who had lived in the town for years, people who had their own quiet stories about the store, finally started to talk. They told reporters about hearing whispers in the aisles and about the general feeling of unease they'd always had in the back of the store. But it was the video that made it all real. The footage took the stories out of the realm of town gossip and turned them into something tangible, something terrifying. The media storm was a nightmare of its own. Camera crews and reporters were always outside, turning Olivia's life into a circus. But the presence in the store, whatever it was, didn't seem to care for an audience. While a news crew was setting up for an interview, the reporter talking to the camera, a single bag of potato chips slid from a metal rack behind him and fell to the floor. The reporter glanced back, annoyed at the interruption. The cameraman just zoomed in on Olivia's face. On its own, it was nothing. A bag of chips falls off a flimsy rack. It happens. But Olivia knew. It was a small, dismissive gesture. It was a sign that it was still there, and it was not interested in performing. The new attention brought the local police. The chief, a man named Miller who had known Olivia since she was a girl, came himself. He was a serious man, someone you could trust. He watched the videos in Olivia's office, his face unreadable. His deputies, who had been joking quietly in the main store, fell silent as they watched cans fly and boxes tumble with no one there. They started their own investigation. They searched for wires, for magnets, for any hidden device that could explain it. They went through every inch of the store, from the dusty attic to the damp basement. They found nothing, not a single thing out of place. After 2 days, Chief Miller came back to the store alone. Olivia was in her office, staring into a cold cup of coffee, exhausted from a lack of sleep. Miller sat down across from her, his face set like stone. He looked tired and angry. "Olivia," he said, his voice low and firm. "I've been a cop in this town for 30 years. I've seen some bad things, but I've never seen anything like this. We've got nothing. There's no explanation." He leaned forward, his eyes locked on hers. He wasn't asking, He was telling her how it was going to be. "You need to quit this," he said, his voice sharp. "Stop talking to the news. This is a nice, quiet town. We don't need all this outside crap stirring things up. Let it go." Olivia was stunned. "But what about what's happening?" she asked. "There's nothing we can do," he said, standing up. "So we're going to stop talking about it." End of story. He walked to the door and left without another word, the door clicking shut behind him. And just like that, the violent activity stopped. The moment the town's highest authority told her to bury the story, the chaos ended. The flying paint cans, the crashing shelves, the scratching in the walls, it all ceased. The silence that came back was different. It was deep and heavy, filled with the weight of an unanswered question. It was the silence of a problem being ignored, not solved. The news moved on, and the story of the general store incident became a forgotten headline. But Olivia never forgot. She kept running her store day in and day out. For the most part, things were normal, but now she was scarred. Every once in a while, a can would topple from a pyramid display, or a box would slide off a shelf as she walked past. It was the kind of thing that happens in any store, every day. It was the kind of thing she never would have noticed before. But now, every single time her breath would catch in her throat, her heart would pound. She'd stare at the fallen item and wonder, was that just gravity? Or was it a quiet, faint reminder that it was still there, watching from the silence she had been forced to keep? She would never know for sure, and that was the true horror she was left to live with. The numbers on the screen didn't make sense. Anderson leaned back in his office chair, the slight squeak of the vinyl the only sound besides the low whir of his computer tower. He was a historian. His job, his entire life, was about things that made sense. He dealt in facts, in records, in things you could prove. So when he saw the census report from a forgotten valley out in western Montana, he was sure it was a mistake, a typo. It had to be. The record for 2002 showed a population of 847 people. The record for 2003 showed just 12. Anderson rubbed his eyes and leaned in closer. The soft click of his mouse was loud in the quiet room. He cross-referenced everything he could find. Old tax records, school attendance logs, property deeds. They all told the same impossible story. In the space of a year, over 800 people in a small, isolated town had simply ceased to be there. There was no record of a disaster, no news reports of a fire, a flood, or some chemical spill. No mass exodus reported. Nothing. They were just gone. For a man who built his life on a foundation of evidence, it was a crack straight through the bedrock. This wasn't just a mystery. It felt like a challenge, an insult to logic itself. A week later, his car was kicking up dust on a gravel road that wasn't on most maps. The smooth hiss of the highway had been replaced by the steady, grinding crunch of tires on stone. The further he drove, the quieter the world became, until the only sounds were his engine and the whisper of wind through the tall pines that crowded the road. He finally pulled into the town, and it was like driving into a photograph. The place was perfectly preserved and completely empty. A children's swing set in a small park sat motionless, its chains giving a faint rhythmic squeak in the breeze. Homes stood with peeling paint, but they were solid, their windows like vacant eyes. He got out of his car, the silence pressing in on him. He walked down the main street. Through one dusty window, he saw a child's toy truck on a living room floor. In a backyard, a line of faded shirts and jeans hung from a clothesline, swaying stiffly. The clothes were bleached pale by years of sun. The wind blew through the open door of what looked like a general store, making a high, lonely whistling sound from deep inside. It was a place where everyone had left in the middle of a sentence. Anderson's mind raced, trying to find a logical reason. A mass exodus for work? A religious group that moved on? But why leave everything? What could make people abandon their lives so completely without so much as a note? He found the remaining 12 residents. They were all elderly, living in a small cluster of homes at one end of town. They had a look on their faces he'd never seen before, a deep, settled kind of terror, worn into their wrinkles like dirt. When he tried to ask them what happened, they just shook their heads. Their voices were thin, like dry leaves skittering across pavement. They only told him to leave. One old woman, her hands shaking, just put a finger to her lips and shushed him, a look of pure panic in her eyes, as if saying the words would call something terrible back. He knew he'd get nothing from them. He was a historian, so he decided to do what he did best. The town hall was a small, single-story wooden building at the end of the main street. The front door was unlocked. Inside, the air was stale and thick with the smell of old paper and damp wood. A layer of dust covered everything, sparkling in the beams of light cutting through the grimy windows. It was clear no one had worked here in a long time. This wasn't an active office. It was a tomb for paperwork. He was completely alone. He ran his hand along a row of tall metal filing cabinets. He was looking for proof of a calculated migration, for financial records, for anything. He pulled open a drawer. Empty. He tried another. It was filled with tax forms from the 1970s. It was all wrong. The important records, the logs and deeds from the early 2000s, were simply gone. It wasn't that they were locked away. The files themselves had been surgically removed, leaving a strange, inexplicable gap in the town's history. It was a deliberate erasure. The empty town no longer felt sad. It felt dangerous. The weeks wore on. The quiet of the town stopped feeling peaceful and started to feel heavy, like being underwater. It was the quiet of a tomb. He was ready to give up, to pack his car and drive away from the puzzle he couldn't solve. Then he found it. In a dusty office in the back of the town hall, he found a desk drawer that was jammed shut. He pulled on it, and the old wood groaned in protest. He gave it one last, hard yank. The drawer shot open with a crack, and a dry, musty smell of forgotten paper filled the air. Lying inside was a small, leather-bound journal. He picked it up. The pages were yellow and brittle. The handwriting inside was neat, but it slanted hard to the right, like the person was writing in a hurry, afraid of being seen. He flipped to the final entry, dated just 2 weeks before the disappearance. The entry didn't talk about a plan or a leader. It talked about a dream that everyone in the town had started having, all at the same time. In the dream, they saw a beautiful, sun-drenched valley they had never seen before. In the middle of this valley stood a tall, perfectly black tower, and in their minds, a deep, silent voice told them it was time to go, that they were being called home. The writer described the fear the dream caused, but also a powerful, unsettling peace that came with it. The entry, the very last words in the journal, ended with a simple, chilling sentence. "We can't fight the call, it's too beautiful." Anderson put the journal down. The low whir from his computer back in his office had always been a sound of comfort, of logic at work. Now the memory of it felt like a mockery. This wasn't a mass migration he could explain with data. This wasn't a cult. This was a town that had been taken, lured away by something they couldn't resist, without a single person in the outside world noticing. The long drive home was a blur. The normal world of highways and gas stations felt fake, like a flimsy stage set. He was back in his office now, his notes and charts spread across his desk, all of it useless. His fortress of facts and reason had been demolished. The world he knew, the one that ran on rules and evidence, felt thinner now, a fragile crust over something deep and inexplicable. The horror wasn't an event that was over. It was a piece of knowledge he now had to live with. It was the certainty that something could have the power to convince 835 people to walk away from their lives and do it so perfectly that they left no trace. The true horror was knowing it was possible. And in the quiet moments, when the world was still, one thought would rise up, a question he knew would be with him for the rest of his life. Who or what had made the call?